Narcissism is often spoken about as if it were a visible trait, something loud, obvious, and easy to recognize. In reality, it is a psychological structure that operates quietly beneath behavior, shaping how a person experiences themselves, other people, and the world around them. At its core, narcissism is not about vanity or confidence, but about regulation. It is a system built to hold a fragile inner sense of self together, to maintain coherence, stability, and emotional balance in situations where that stability feels constantly under threat. What appears outwardly as certainty or self-importance is often the surface expression of an internal effort to remain intact. Psychological research details narcissism as a pattern of self-organization rather than a single behavior. It develops as a way of managing identity, worth, and emotional safety. This is why narcissistic traits can exist on a spectrum. Mild forms are common and even adaptive in certain contexts, such as leadership, performance, or competition. More rigid forms create difficulties, not because of intention or malice, but because the system itself prioritizes self-protection above flexibility. Understanding narcissism requires looking beyond actions and focusing instead on the internal pressures that drive them. One of the defining features of narcissistic psychology is instability beneath apparent control. The internal self-image is not fixed or secure. It must be continuously reinforced through external signals such as approval, recognition, status, or superiority. These signals function like structural supports. When they are present, the system feels stable. When they are absent, the sense of self can weaken rapidly, producing anxiety, irritation, or withdrawal. This creates a dependency on the environment, not in an obvious emotional way, but in a regulatory one. Rather than experiencing self-worth as something intrinsic, it is experienced as conditional and situational. It rises and falls in response to feedback. This is why narcissistic patterns often involve heightened sensitivity to criticism, comparison, or perceived disrespect. These are not merely social slights. They register internally as threats to coherence. The reaction is not about the content of the criticism, but about the destabilizing effect it has on the internal structure holding identity together. To understand how this structure forms, it is necessary to look at early psychological development. Human identity does not emerge fully formed. It is built gradually through interaction, feedback, and emotional attunement. When early experiences provide inconsistent validation, conditional acceptance, emotional absence, or excessive overvaluation, the developing self may struggle to balance. In response, the mind learns to construct a protective framework. This framework emphasizes control, distinction, and self-focus, not because connection is unwanted, but because dependence feels unsafe. In some cases, affirmation is given only when performance or image meets certain standards. In others, attention may be excessive but shallow, focused on appearance or achievement rather than emotional reality. Both conditions can lead to a similar outcome. The developing self learns that worth is something that must be earned, displayed, or defended. Over time, this lesson becomes embedded, shaping adult patterns of motivation and behavior. Internally, narcissistic psychology is often marked by constant self-monitoring. Thoughts revolve around position, evaluation, and comparison. There is a quiet vigilance, an ongoing assessment of how one is being seen, ranked, or measured. This vigilance is mentally demanding, even if it is not consciously recognized as such. It can produce fatigue, irritability, and emotional flatness, particularly in environments where validation is unpredictable. Grandiosity, often misunderstood as arrogance, serves a stabilizing function within this system. It creates a buffer against vulnerability by inflating self-perception. When the inner sense of worth feels fragile, expansion feels safer than exposure. This does not mean the individual believes they are flawless. Often the opposite is true beneath the surface. The outward certainty compensates for internal doubt, not superiority. This internal arrangement shapes how attention functions. Attention is not merely desired. It regulates emotional equilibrium. Positive attention reinforces stability. Negative attention can also serve a purpose by confirming significance. Indifference, however, is destabilizing. It removes the external reference points the system relies on. This is why absence of response can be more unsettling than criticism. The system is oriented around being registered, not necessarily admired. Over time, this way of organizing experience becomes self-reinforcing. Behaviors that secure validation are repeated. Environments that reward performance, dominance, or visibility are preferred. Situations that require vulnerability, reciprocity, or uncertainty may feel uncomfortable or draining. None of this requires conscious planning. It unfolds through pattern, repetition, and internal feedback loops. Understanding narcissism in this way removes the need for judgment or exaggeration. It becomes a study of psychological adaptation, a system designed to maintain stability in the face of perceived threat, a structure that prioritizes coherence over flexibility, and a pattern that explains behavior not through intention, but through internal necessity. As this structure settles into adulthood, it begins to influence how emotions are processed and expressed. Emotional experiences are often filtered through their effect on self-stability. Feelings that reinforce strength, competence, or superiority are more easily tolerated and sometimes amplified. Feelings that suggest weakness, dependence, or uncertainty are harder to integrate. They are not absent, but they are often managed indirectly through distraction, rationalization, or externalization. This can create an emotional style that appears controlled or detached, while internally remaining highly reactive. Shame plays a central role in this internal landscape. Unlike guilt, which relates to specific actions, shame affects the entire sense of self. In narcissistic psychology, shame is not always consciously felt, but it is actively avoided. The system is organized around preventing exposure to it. This is why situations that imply inadequacy, rejection, or loss of status can trigger strong reactions. The response may appear disproportionate, but internally it is protective. It is an attempt to prevent collapse of the self-image rather than a response to the immediate situation. Envy is another emotion that frequently appears within this structure, though it is rarely recognized as such. Envy arises when comparison highlights perceived deficiency. In a system dependent on external reference points, comparison is constant. Success in others can register not as neutral information, but as a threat to balance. To manage this, the mind may diminish the value of others, question legitimacy, or shift focus toward alternative measures of superiority. These responses restore equilibrium by reducing perceived threat. Empathy within narcissistic patterns is often misunderstood. Cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what others feel or think, is usually intact. Emotional empathy, the ability to share and resonate with those feelings, can be inconsistent. This inconsistency is not due to absence of feeling, but to prioritization. When emotional resonance threatens self-stability, it may be dampened or bypassed. When it does not, it can be present and even sophisticated. This explains why empathy may appear selectively applied rather than universally absent. Relationships mirror this internal organization. Early stages are often characterized by idealization. The other person is experienced as valuable, affirming, or stabilizing. As long as this function is maintained, connection feels rewarding. Over time, however, inevitable differences, limits, or disappointments emerge. These moments introduce instability. The system responds by distancing, devaluing, or reasserting control. These shifts are not strategic in a calculated sense. They are regulatory adjustments. Intimacy requires tolerance of uncertainty and mutual influence. For a structure built around self-protection, this tolerance can be limited. Intimacy may feel safe when admiration or alignment is strong, and unsafe when independence or difference appears. This creates a pattern of fluctuation rather than steady connection. Again, this is not driven by lack of interest in others, but by the constraints of the internal system itself. In professional or public settings, narcissistic traits can be adaptive. Confidence, assertiveness, and focus on achievement are often rewarded. Clear hierarchies and measurable success provide predictable reinforcement. In these environments, the system operates smoothly. Difficulties are more likely to arise in ambiguous, emotionally complex contexts where feedback is subtle or delayed. Here, the lack of clear reinforcement can produce restlessness or dissatisfaction. Over time, these patterns tend to persist because they work. They maintain stability, reduce exposure to shame, and provide a sense of direction. Change would require tolerating periods of instability, uncertainty, and reduced control. For a system designed specifically to avoid these states, such change is inherently challenging. This does not imply permanence or inevitability. It simply explains resistance. Seen through this lens, narcissism becomes less a collection of behaviours and more a method of psychological organization, a way the mind arranges experience to remain coherent. It is neither mysterious nor monstrous. It is structured, patterned, and understandable. And like all psychological structures, it reflects adaptation to earlier conditions rather than conscious choice. As the narcissistic structure continues to operate, it shapes how reality itself is interpreted. Events are not experienced neutrally. They are filtered through relevance to self-stability. Neutral interactions may be scanned for implication. Ambiguous remarks may be interpreted as evaluative. Silence may be experienced as dismissal. This perceptual bias does not arise from paranoia, but from necessity. When the self depends on external reference points to remain coherent, the environment must be constantly read for signals. The world becomes a feedback system rather than a shared space. This alters how responsibility is experienced. Success is often internalized fully, reinforcing coherence and superiority. Failure is more difficult to integrate. It threatens the internal balance and may therefore be attributed to external factors, unfair conditions, or the limitations of others. This is not always deliberate deflection. It is an automatic stabilizing response. Accepting fault would require tolerating a temporary collapse in self-image, something the system is designed to prevent. Control plays an important role here. Predictability reduces threat. When outcomes can be shaped or influenced, internal stability is preserved. This can manifest as a preference for structured environments, clear roles, or dominance within hierarchies. It can also appear as rigidity around routines, opinions, or standards. Flexibility introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty introduces vulnerability. Control therefore functions as emotional regulation rather than power-seeking. Over time, this need for regulation can produce emotional narrowing. Experiences are evaluated primarily for their effect on self-image, rather than for intrinsic meaning. Curiosity, playfulness, and openness may be present, but constrained. Emotional range becomes selective. What supports stability is allowed. What destabilizes is restricted. This can lead to a sense of inner emptiness, not because emotion is absent, but because experience is filtered so tightly that spontaneity has little space to emerge. Despite this, narcissistic psychology often includes a strong drive toward achievement and creation. Building, performing, leading, or producing can provide sustained reinforcement. These activities offer measurable feedback and social recognition, which stabilize the self. In many cases, this results in high functioning, productivity, and visible success. The cost is often internal. Constant maintenance leaves little room for rest. When reinforcement weakens, the system becomes strained. Loss of status, aging, rejection, or prolonged lack of recognition can expose the underlying fragility. Reactions during these periods may include irritability, withdrawal, defensiveness, or sudden shifts in behavior. These are not signs of collapse in the dramatic sense. They are signs of a system operating under reduced support. It is important to distinguish narcissistic traits from cruelty or intentional harm. While harm can occur, it is often secondary rather than primary. Behavior is organized around protection, not punishment. Others may feel disregarded not because they are unseen, but because the system has limited capacity to hold both self-stability and relational complexity simultaneously. This limitation shapes outcomes regardless of intention. Across the lifespan, narcissistic patterns may soften, harden, or transform depending on environment. Supportive contexts that provide consistent but non-conditional validation can reduce reliance on extreme regulation. Highly competitive or image-driven environments can intensify it. The structure remains responsive to reinforcement even if its origins lie in early development. Understanding narcissism in this way allows it to be placed alongside other personality organizations. It is one strategy among many that the human mind can adopt to manage vulnerability. It trades flexibility for stability, openness for control, and depth for coherence. These are not moral failures. They are structural choices shaped by earlier conditions and reinforced over time. In psychology, clarity comes not from labeling, but from tracing function. Narcissism persists because it serves a function. It maintains a sense of self where that sense once felt uncertain. It protects against shame where exposure once felt unsafe. And it organizes experience in a way that allows the individual to move through the world without fragmentation. That organization carries costs, but it also carries logic. As these patterns persist, misunderstandings about narcissism tend to grow around the most visible behaviors rather than the underlying structure. One common misconception is that narcissism is driven by excessive self-love. In reality, the system is organized around self-protection rather than self-appreciation. The internal experience is rarely one of contentment. It is one of vigilance. The appearance of confidence masks an ongoing effort to maintain equilibrium. Another misunderstanding is that narcissistic behavior is always conscious or calculated. In most cases, responses emerge automatically, shaped by long-standing internal rules rather than deliberate intent. It is also frequently assumed that narcissistic individuals lack insight or intelligence about themselves. This is not accurate. Many possess a detailed understanding of their own patterns. What is limited is not awareness, but tolerance. Insight alone does not alter a structure designed to prevent exposure to instability. Knowing that a reaction is defensive does not remove the internal pressure that produces it. Change would require sustained capacity to remain emotionally unsettled without immediately restoring balance, a capacity the system was not built to support. Narcissism also varies significantly across contexts. In environments that reward visibility, confidence, and decisiveness, narcissistic traits can appear adaptive and even admired. Leadership roles, public-facing careers, and competitive fields often align well with this structure. Clear metrics of success provide reliable reinforcement. The individual feels anchored. In contrast, environments that rely on emotional reciprocity, ambiguity, or shared vulnerability place greater strain on the system. Here, the absence of clear validation can produce disengagement or frustration. Solitude presents its own challenges. Without external reference points, the internal system has fewer stabilizers. Some individuals respond by seeking stimulation or distraction. Others become preoccupied with memory, fantasy, or planning. Stillness can amplify internal uncertainty rather than calm it. This is not due to fear of reflection, but due to lack of regulatory input. The self requires signals to remain organized. Aging introduces additional complexity. As roles change and external validation shifts, long-standing reinforcement patterns may weaken. Physical decline, changing status, or reduced attention can strain the structure. Responses vary. Some individuals adapt by redefining sources of value. Others intensify control or withdraw from situations that highlight loss. These shifts again reflect regulation rather than intention. It is important to note that narcissistic patterns are not fixed entities. They exist within a broader personality system that includes temperament, cognition, and emotional capacity. Under certain conditions, flexibility can increase. Under others, rigidity deepens. The structure responds to consistency, predictability, and safety, even if it was originally formed in their absence. When viewed without judgment, narcissism becomes a study in psychological economy. The mind allocates resources to preserve coherence. It limits exposure to destabilizing states. It prioritizes predictability over openness. These priorities shape behavior, emotion, and perception in systematic ways. The resulting patterns are not random. They are organized and internally consistent. This perspective also clarifies why narcissism is so resistant to simplistic explanation. It cannot be reduced to ego, selfishness, or lack of empathy alone. It is an integrated system that governs how worth is experienced, how threat is detected, and how balance is restored. Removing one visible feature does not dissolve the structure. The system adapts. In closing, narcissism can be understood as one way the human psyche attempts to solve the problem of self-continuity. How to remain whole when early experiences made that continuity uncertain. How to maintain identity without reliable internal anchors. The solution prioritizes stability over connection, regulation over vulnerability, and coherence over depth. It works, often impressively, within its own logic. Seen this way, narcissism is neither rare nor alien. It exists along a continuum that includes many everyday strategies for managing self-worth. Its more pronounced forms simply make the structure visible. And when it is examined calmly, without exaggeration or moral framing, it reveals not a mystery, but a system shaped by necessity, reinforced by experience, and sustained because it continues to function. As the structure continues to operate over long periods, its influence becomes most visible in how meaning is assigned. Experiences are rarely allowed to remain neutral. They are evaluated for their impact on self-position, relevance, and stability. Praise is amplified because it reinforces coherence. Criticism is filtered or resisted because it threatens it. Ambiguity is uncomfortable because it offers no clear signal. This selective meaning-making is not intentional distortion. It is the outcome of a system that requires constant feedback to remain organized. This also explains why narcissistic patterns often involve strong narratives about competence, uniqueness, or destiny. These narratives provide continuity. They link past success present identity, and future expectation into a single coherent story. When reality aligns with the narrative, stability is reinforced. When it diverges, tension arises. The mind then works to restore alignment, either by adjusting perception or by changing environment. The narrative itself is rarely questioned because it functions as a stabilizing framework. Within relationships, this narrative function becomes particularly important. Others are often experienced in terms of their role within the self-story. When they reflect value, admiration, or alignment, connection feels secure. When they introduce contradiction, independence, or limits, discomfort increases. This can lead to subtle shifts in attention, emotional availability, or responsiveness. These shifts are not punishments. They are regulatory adjustments aimed at restoring balance. Conflict, when it occurs, is often experienced as destabilizing rather than resolvable. Resolution requires acknowledging mutual influence and shared vulnerability. For a structure oriented around self-protection, this can feel unsafe. As a result, conflict may be avoided, reframed, or escalated into dominance. Each response serves the same purpose: to reduce internal threat and re-establish coherence. It is also important to address how narcissism interacts with morality. Narcissistic patterns do not inherently remove moral understanding. Concepts such as fairness, harm, and responsibility are usually understood intellectually. What differs is prioritization. When morale considerations conflict with self-stability, they may be temporarily subordinated. This is not a lack of ethics, but a hierarchy shaped by regulation needs. The self must remain intact before anything else can be fully considered. This prioritization can create contradictions. A person may hold strong values while acting in ways that appear inconsistent with them. From the outside, this can look like hypocrisy. Internally, it reflects a system under pressure. When stability is threatened, protective responses override abstract principles. Once balance is restored, values may again become accessible. Another area where narcissistic structure becomes visible is in response to dependence. Needing others can feel destabilizing because it introduces uncertainty and loss of control. As a result, dependence may be minimized, denied, or managed indirectly. Support may be accepted when it reinforces competence, but resisted when it implies vulnerability. This creates a paradox. The system relies on external reinforcement, yet resists acknowledging reliance. This paradox contributes to cycles of engagement and withdrawal. Connection is sought when it stabilizes. Distance is created when it threatens autonomy or exposes need. These cycles are often confusing to others, but internally they reflect consistent regulatory logic. Over time, maintaining this system requires effort. Vigilance, narrative maintenance, and emotional filtering consume psychological energy. The individual may not experience this as strain because it has become habitual. Yet fatigue can emerge, particularly when reinforcement becomes harder to obtain. Success may lose its stabilizing effect. Recognition may feel insufficient. The system then demands more input to achieve the same level of balance. At this stage, dissatisfaction can increase even in the presence of outward achievement. The internal system has become efficient but rigid. It preserves coherence, but limits expansion. New experiences are evaluated primarily for safety rather than meaning. Growth becomes constrained by the need to avoid destabilization. This brings the discussion back to function. Narcissism persists not because it is pleasurable, but because it is protective. It is a way of organizing experience to prevent fragmentation. It answers the psychological question of how to remain whole when early conditions made wholeness uncertain. Every feature of the construction, from grandiosity to sensitivity, serves this purpose. As the structure is expressed across different life domains, its consistency becomes clearer. In work and public life, narcissistic organization often appears most stable. These environments provide hierarchy, feedback, and visible outcomes. Success can be measured. Status can be recognized. Effort produces clear signals of value. This clarity aligns well with a system that relies on external reinforcement. Confidence, decisiveness, and assertiveness are rewarded, reinforcing the internal narrative of competence and importance. The structure feels supported rather than strained. In contrast, environments that lack clear metrics place greater pressure on the system. Creative work without feedback, collaborative roles with diffuse responsibility, or emotionally nuanced relationships offer fewer stabilizing signals. Ambiguity increases. Interpretation becomes necessary. In these contexts, the mind must work harder to extract meaning and reassurance. This can lead to impatience, disengagement, or overcompensation through control or dominance. Leadership is often discussed in relation to narcissism because the overlap is visible. Narcissistic traits can support leadership by reducing hesitation and increasing visibility. However, the same traits can limit adaptability. When leadership requires admitting uncertainty, sharing power, or integrating dissent, the system may resist. These moments challenge the stabilizing narrative. The response is often to reassert authority or narrow perspective rather than expand it. In creative fields, narcissistic organization can drive productivity and ambition. Creation offers a means of self-expression and validation. Public recognition reinforces coherence. At the same time, creative uncertainty can be destabilizing. Periods of low output or criticism may trigger disproportionate reactions. The creative process becomes entangled with self-regulation rather than exploration alone. Social dynamics are also shaped by this structure. Groups provide comparison and positioning. Status within a group can stabilize or destabilize self-image depending on rank and recognition. Inclusion feels reinforcing when it affirms value. Exclusion or marginalization can feel threatening beyond the social level. It touches identity. Responses may include withdrawal, rivalry, or attempts to reassert prominence. It is also important to distinguish narcissistic organization from related psychological patterns. Narcissism differs from antisocial patterns in that it remains oriented toward recognition and validation rather than disregard for others. It differs from avoidant patterns in that engagement is sought rather than avoided, provided it is reinforcing. It differs from dependent patterns in that reliance is resisted even while reinforcement is required. These distinctions help clarify why narcissism cannot be reduced to a single trait or behavior. Another distinction lies between overt and covert expressions. Some individuals display confidence and visibility openly. Others express narcissistic organization through sensitivity, withdrawal, or internal comparison. The underlying structure remains similar. What differs is how regulation is achieved. One seeks reinforcement through prominence, the other through moral superiority, uniqueness, or imagined recognition. Both rely on external reference points to maintain coherence. Over time, these patterns interact with circumstance. Repeated success can reinforce rigidity. Repeated failure can intensify defensiveness. Mixed experiences may soften extremes, encouraging partial flexibility. The structure adapts, but it rarely dissolves entirely. It remains available as a familiar method of regulation, especially under stress. This explains why narcissistic responses often intensify during periods of transition. Career changes, relationship shifts, loss of status, or aging all disrupt established reinforcement patterns. The system responds by increasing vigilance. Behavior may become more controlling, more sensitive, or more withdrawn. These are not regressions. They are predictable responses to reduced stability. What is often overlooked is that narcissistic organization limits not only connection, but also rest. Constant monitoring and narrative maintenance leave little space for psychological ease. Relaxation requires trust in continuity without reinforcement. For a system built around vigilance, this trust is difficult. Calm may feel empty rather than restorative. Stimulation becomes a substitute for rest. As the structure persists, it shapes identity over time. The self becomes increasingly defined by role, function, or recognition. Inner experience becomes secondary. This can produce a sense of hollowness, even amid achievement. Not because success is meaningless, but because meaning has been outsourced to external confirmation. Resistance to change is one of the most consistent features of narcissistic organization, and it follows directly from how the structure functions. Change introduces instability. It disrupts familiar regulatory patterns and removes predictable sources of reinforcement. For a system designed specifically to prevent internal collapse, this disruption is experienced not as growth, but as threat. Even when outcomes appear beneficial, the process itself can feel unsafe. This is why insight alone rarely alters narcissistic patterns. Understanding does not replace regulation. Attempts to modify behavior without addressing regulation tend to fail because they remove stabilizers without offering alternatives. When admiration, control, or narrative coherence are reduced, internal tension increases. The system responds by restoring familiar patterns. This is not defiance. It is preservation. Stability must be maintained before flexibility can be tolerated. Without stability, change cannot be integrated. This also explains why narcissistic structures often appear adaptive until circumstances shift. As long as reinforcement remains consistent, the system functions efficiently. When reinforcement weakens, the underlying fragility becomes more visible. The same behaviors that once maintained balance may no longer suffice. The system compensates by intensifying vigilance or control, further limiting openness. This can create a cycle where increasing effort produces diminishing returns. Comparison with adjacent psychological structures clarifies this further. In avoidant organization, threat is managed by withdrawal and minimization of exposure. In dependent organization, threat is managed through attachment and reassurance seeking. In narcissistic organization, threat is managed through self-reinforcement and control. Each strategy prioritizes a different form of stability. Narcissism prioritizes internal coherence through external confirmation. This distinction explains why approaches effective for other patterns often fail here. Another important distinction lies between behavior and structure. Behaviors can change temporarily under pressure or incentive. Structures change slowly, if at all, because they are embedded in how experience is processed. A person may appear less narcissistic in one context and more in another, depending on available reinforcement. The structure remains constant, but its expression shifts. Over long periods, the cost of maintaining this structure becomes clearer. Emotional range narrows. Experience is filtered for relevance rather than richness. Relationships are managed rather than inhabited. Success provides relief but not rest. Failure feels catastrophic rather than instructive. These costs accumulate quietly. They do not necessarily produce crisis, but they limit depth. Despite this, narcissistic organization often includes significant strengths. Focus, ambition, resilience under pressure, and capacity for performance can be pronounced. The system is efficient. It mobilizes energy toward goals. It reduces hesitation. These strengths explain why narcissistic traits persist and are reinforced socially. The cost is paid internally rather than externally, and often only becomes visible when reinforcement declines. As the structure ages, adaptation becomes necessary. Some individuals broaden their sources of stability, integrating roles that offer less dramatic but more consistent reinforcement. Others narrow further, retreating into familiar patterns. Neither outcome is predetermined. What remains consistent is the underlying need for coherence. The system will seek it wherever it can be found. At a psychological level, narcissism illustrates a fundamental human problem: how to maintain a continuous sense of self across changing conditions. When early experiences do not provide reliable internal anchors, the mind constructs external ones. These anchors stabilize identity, but they tether it to context. Freedom is traded for security. Depth is traded for coherence. Seen in this light, narcissism is not an excess of self, but a defense against its absence. It is an attempt to ensure that the self remains present, visible, and intact. The behaviours that emerge from this attempt are secondary. They are expressions of a deeper organizational logic. As these patterns consolidate over time, the distinction between identity and function becomes increasingly blurred. The self is experienced less as an inner continuity and more as a set of roles, achievements, and recognitions that must be maintained. Identity becomes something that is performed and confirmed, rather than simply felt. This does not produce constant distress. It produces conditional stability. When roles are clear and reinforcement is available, the system feels organized. When roles weaken or recognition fades, coherence is threatened. This functional identity influences how memory is organized. Past experiences are often recalled selectively, emphasizing moments of success, competence, or admiration. Failures may be minimized, reframed, or remembered in ways that protect the narrative. This is not conscious revision. Memory itself becomes structured around regulation. The past serves the present need for stability rather than objective reconstruction. Future orientation is shaped in a similar way. Plans and ambitions often focus on outcomes that promise recognition or distinction. These goals provide direction and continuity. Unstructured futures, where value is uncertain or not externally marked, can feel unsettling. The mind prefers trajectories that offer predictable reinforcement. This reinforces ambition, but also limits exploration. In interpersonal perception, others are often evaluated by their capacity to affirm or threaten stability. This evaluation is usually subtle and implicit. People who provide admiration, alignment, or utility feel safe. People who introduce criticism, independence, or unpredictability feel destabilizing. The resulting preferences shape social networks over time. Relationships that support coherence persist. Others fade or fracture. This pattern can create the impression of selective attachment. Warmth and engagement may be present in some contexts and absent in others. Consistency is difficult when internal regulation depends on external variables. Emotional availability fluctuates with perceived safety. Again, this is not indifference. It is conditional capacity. One of the more misunderstood aspects of narcissistic organization is its relationship to vulnerability. Vulnerability is not avoided because it is weak, but because it is unregulated. It introduces states that the system has no efficient way to stabilize. Exposure without immediate reinforcement feels dangerous. As a result, Vulnerability may be intellectualized, aestheticized, or displayed in controlled forms that preserve narrative dominance. Genuine uncertainty is far more difficult to tolerate. This also shapes communication. Language may emphasize certainty, explanation, or framing. Ambiguity is reduced where possible. When uncertainty is unavoidable, it may be reframed as insight or superiority. Communication becomes another regulatory tool. It maintains coherence by organizing meaning. Across time, the system becomes familiar and automatic. It does not require constant conscious effort. It operates through habits of attention, interpretation, and response. Because it works, it is rarely questioned. Discomfort is attributed to external conditions rather than internal structure. The system remains invisible to itself. Yet no structure operates without limits. When reinforcement becomes scarce or inconsistent, strain increases. The familiar strategies produce less relief. The internal tension becomes more noticeable. Some individuals respond by intensifying effort, seeking greater recognition or control. Others reduce engagement, narrowing their world to what feels manageable. Both responses reflect the same need: to restore coherence. At a broader psychological level, narcissism illustrates how identity can become dependent on context. It shows how the mind solves the problem of self-continuity by anchoring worth externally. This solution is efficient, but fragile. It requires maintenance. It resists disruption. It narrows experience to what can be stabilized. As the script approaches its later stages, the emphasis remains on synthesis. Narcissism has been examined as development, structure, emotion, perception, relationship, and time. Each layer reflects the same organizing principle: preserve coherence, avoid fragmentation, maintain stability. What remains is not to resolve this structure, but to situate it. Narcissism is one expression of how the human psyche adapts to uncertainty. It is neither exceptional nor rare. It exists in degrees, shaped by environment and reinforcement. Its more pronounced forms reveal the underlying logic that quieter forms also share. As the structure is viewed in its entirety, a final pattern becomes clear. Narcissism is not organized around happiness, satisfaction, or connection. It is organized around continuity. The central aim is to ensure that the self remains intact from moment to moment, situation to situation, without falling into uncertainty or internal collapse. Every feature described so far — vigilance, narrative control, selective empathy, regulation through attention, and resistance to change — serves this single purpose. The system is consistent because the need it answers is consistent. This consistency explains why narcissistic organization often appears rational from the inside, even when it appears confusing from the outside. Responses that seem excessive or cold are internally proportional to the perceived threat. The threat is not social embarrassment or disagreement. It is destabilization. Once this is understood, the behavior no longer appears random. It follows a logic that prioritizes preservation over expansion. It also explains why moral framing rarely captures the reality of narcissism. Moral language assumes choice and intention. Narcissistic patterns operate largely beneath conscious decision-making. The system reacts before reflection can occur. By the time behavior is noticed, regulation has already taken place. Judgment addresses the outcome, not the mechanism. Understanding requires tracing the mechanism itself. Across a lifetime, this structure can produce mixed outcomes. It can support achievement, resilience, and visible success. It can also limit intimacy, rest, and emotional depth. These outcomes coexist because the system is not designed to optimize well-being. It is designed to prevent disintegration. Stability is achieved, but at a cost. That cost is paid gradually through narrowing experience rather than dramatic failure. One of the most important implications of this understanding is that narcissism cannot be resolved by removing visible traits alone. Reducing confidence, ambition, or assertiveness does not address the underlying need for coherence. Without alternative stabilizers, the system will simply reassert itself in new forms. The structure adapts rather than disappears. It remains available as long as the conditions that shaped it remain unresolved. This is why narcissistic organization often persists even when it causes difficulty. The difficulty is familiar. Instability is not. The system chooses the known cost over the unknown risk. This choice is not conscious. It is embedded in how safety is defined internally. When placed alongside other forms of psychological organization, narcissism reveals something universal. All personality structures are attempts to manage vulnerability. They differ in strategy, not purpose. Some rely on closeness. Some rely on withdrawal. Some rely on control and reinforcement. None are inherently pathological in isolation. They become limiting when their strategy becomes exclusive. Narcissism becomes most visible when its strategy is overused. When reinforcement becomes the primary source of identity. When coherence is maintained at the expense of flexibility. When protection replaces exploration. These shifts do not occur suddenly. They develop gradually through repetition and success. The system works, so it is used again. In this sense, narcissism is less about excess and more about imbalance. Too much weight placed on external confirmation. Too little trust in internal continuity. The structure compensates for this imbalance efficiently, but it never fully resolves it. The need remains. Seen calmly, without exaggeration, narcissism illustrates the limits of self-construction. It shows how identity can be built from achievement, recognition, and role, and how such an identity must be maintained continuously to remain stable. It also shows what is lost when identity is not grounded internally. Rest becomes difficult. Presence becomes conditional. Experience becomes evaluated rather than inhabited. This does not make narcissism tragic or dramatic. It makes it understandable. It places it within the broader landscape of human adaptation. The mind does what it can with the conditions it is given. It builds structures that work, even if they are imperfect. As this exploration closes, narcissism can be left where it belongs. Not as a label to be applied, and not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a system to be understood. A psychological arrangement shaped by early conditions, reinforced by environment, and sustained because it continues to provide coherence. Understanding it requires patience rather than judgment, clarity rather than simplification, and attention to function rather than appearance. When these are applied, narcissism reveals itself not as an enigma, but as a pattern. One that explains itself quietly, through its logic, its limits, and its persistence over time. As this exploration comes to rest, narcissism can be left in its proper psychological context. Not as a problem to be solved, and not as a trait to be singled out, but as a structure that explains itself through consistency. Everything described, the vigilance, the need for reinforcement, the resistance to vulnerability, the selective empathy, the attachment to role and recognition, follows from a single organizing aim: to remain intact, to preserve continuity, to avoid the experience of internal fragmentation. When viewed this way, narcissism no longer needs exaggeration to be understood. It does not require dramatic language or moral framing. It reveals its logic quietly. It shows how the mind adapts when internal stability feels uncertain, and how external anchors are used to compensate for that uncertainty. These anchors work. They provide structure. They give direction. They allow functioning, achievement, and visibility. They also bind identity to context, requiring constant maintenance. This arrangement shapes how life is experienced. Moments of success bring relief rather than satisfaction. Recognition brings steadiness rather than peace. Silence brings unease rather than rest. The system remains active because it must. Coherence depends on engagement. Stillness offers no confirmation. Without confirmation, the structure feels exposed. Nothing about this requires pathology to be present. Narcissistic organization exists on a continuum. Many ordinary strategies for maintaining self-worth share the same foundations. Comparison, achievement, image, and recognition are common stabilizers. Narcissism becomes visible only when reliance on these stabilizers becomes dominant, when they replace internal continuity rather than support it. This explains why narcissistic traits are often reinforced rather than challenged. Modern environments reward visibility, confidence, and performance. They provide clear metrics and frequent comparison. They strengthen external anchoring. The structure adapts well to these conditions. It is not broken by them. It is refined by them. What is lost is not capacity, but range. Experience becomes narrower. Meaning becomes conditional. Rest becomes difficult. The self remains present, but always slightly tense, always requiring confirmation. The structure succeeds at preservation, but preservation is not the same as ease. In the end, narcissism stands as one expression of how the human psyche manages uncertainty. It is neither rare nor exceptional. It reflects the same adaptive logic found in many forms of personality organization. The mind builds what it needs to remain whole. It chooses stability when continuity feels fragile. It chooses coherence when depth feels unsafe. Understanding narcissism requires no instruction and no correction. It requires only attention to function. When function is made clear, behavior becomes predictable. When predictability is recognized, exaggeration falls away. What remains is a system shaped by necessity, reinforced by experience, and sustained because it continues to work. And with that clarity, the structure no longer demands reaction. It can simply be observed as one of the many quiet ways the mind arranges itself to remain intact over time.